The first time I introduced my wife to my family was supposed to be one of those moments you remember with warmth. The kind you tell your kids about years later, where everyone sits around the table, laughter bouncing off the walls, stories flowing like wine. But what actually happened burned into my memory for all the wrong reasons because it revealed something ugly about the people I grew up with. Something I never wanted to see. Something that left me sitting in silence with my fists clenched under the table. My wife walked into that dinner with her usual grace. She had even been practicing how to greet them in English without stumbling because she wanted to make a good impression. She wore the soft blue dress I loved because she said it made her feel confident. And she smiled at everyone with that nervous but genuine warmth she always carries when she's meeting new people. But the moment she spoke, the moment that gentle lilt of her accent slipped through her words, I saw it. The twitch of my mom's lips as she tried to hide a smirk. The quick glance my dad gave across the table. The muffled laugh from my brother-in-law. And it started small, like an inside joke they couldn't resist sharing. My mom tilted her head, repeated one of my wife's words slowly, dragging out the vowels in a mock version of her accent. And she said it with that tone people use when they think they're being harmless but deep down they know they're poking fun. And my dad chuckled, "Guess we'll need subtitles at Christmas dinner." And everyone laughed like it was the funniest thing they'd heard all night. Except me, sitting frozen, and my wife, who smiled tightly as her knuckles whitened around the fork she held. I wanted to say something right then. I wanted to slam my hand down and call them out. But I hesitated. Because part of me thought maybe I was overreacting. Maybe she didn't notice. But then I saw her eyes. The way they flickered down to her plate. The way her shoulders sank just a little. And I knew. She noticed every word. And they didn't stop there. My brother-in-law leaned in and exaggerated the way she had pronounced vegetable just minutes earlier, stretching it out into some clownish sound. And even my sister, who should have known better, giggled and said, "Oh my God, say it again. It's so cute." Cute. That's the word they used to turn my wife's voice into a joke. Her identity into a punchline. And she laughed along because she's polite. Because she hates confrontation. Because she didn't want me to be caught between her and my family. But I could see it in her eyes. Every little jab was cutting her deeper. The night dragged on. My parents making innocent comments about how brave she must be to move here. How funny it must be when she talks to strangers. And at one point my dad even turned to me and said, "She must be lucky you can translate when people don't understand her." And that was the moment I nearly lost it. Because my wife is fluent. Smarter than half the people in that room. She just has an accent. And the way they turned that into weakness made my blood boil. When dinner finally ended, she thanked them graciously, hugged my mom even though she didn't deserve it, smiled at my dad, and told my sister she was glad to meet her. And the entire car ride home she stared out the window, her reflection in the glass looking so small, so far away. I reached for her hand and said, "I'm sorry," and she squeezed my fingers once and whispered, "It's okay, I'm used to it." And those words shattered me. Because no one should ever be used to being mocked for who they are. That night, lying in bed, she fell asleep quickly, exhaustion pulling her under. But I stayed awake staring at the ceiling. The laughter of my family echoing in my head like poison. And I swore I would never let them treat her like that again. Never let them get away with turning her identity into a game. But here's the thing. Sometimes in life you don't even have to fight back yourself. Sometimes life does the work for you. Because a few months later the exact same people who had mocked her accent, who had laughed at her words like children on a playground, came crawling back to us. Not with their smug smiles. Not with their cheap jokes. But with desperation in their voices and fear in their eyes. Because suddenly they needed something. Something only my wife's family could give. And that's when I realized karma doesn't whisper. Karma arrives loud, sharp, and dripping with irony so thick you almost feel sorry for the people choking on it, almost. But not quite. Weeks passed after that dinner, and every time we visited them or they came to us I noticed the same pattern. Little digs wrapped in smiles. Casual jokes that cut sharper than knives. My mom asking my wife to repeat words just to laugh at how she pronounced them. My dad smirking and turning to me like he was waiting for me to translate even though she was perfectly clear. And my sister pretending to compliment her by saying things like, "It's so charming when you say things wrong." And each time I bit my tongue until it bled because my wife would squeeze my hand under the table. silently pleading with me not to start a fight. And I listened because I didn't want to make her more uncomfortable. But the anger grew in me like a storm I couldn't release. One night after another exhausting dinner where my in-laws mocked her toast to the family by repeating her words back in slow, exaggerated tones, she broke down in the car, tears spilling as she whispered, "I know I'm not perfect. I know I have an accent. But why can't they just hear me?" And I pulled over, turned to her and said, "You are perfect. You're more than perfect. It's them who are broken." And I promised again that I'd protect her. But she shook her head. "They're your family. I don't want to come between you." And I didn't know how to tell her that in my heart she already was my family. The only family that mattered. And they were the ones pushing me away with every cruel laugh. Then came the twist. The part that no one could have predicted. The part that turned their laughter into silence and their smugness into begging. Because a few months later I got a call from my dad. His voice strained, almost cracked, and he asked if we could come over because there was something serious he needed to talk about. And when we arrived, the living room atmosphere wasn't smug or mocking. It was heavy with tension. My parents sitting on the couch with my sister perched on the armrest. All of them fidgeting, avoiding eye contact, and I knew immediately something was wrong. My dad cleared his throat and started rambling about the economy. About how things are tough. My mom chimed in about unexpected expenses. And finally my sister blurted out, "We need help. We need a loan." And the room went dead quiet. My wife blinked in surprise. I leaned back in my chair and asked, "How much?" And my dad said, "50,000, like it was nothing, like he was asking for a ride to the store." And I almost laughed at the audacity. My wife stayed silent, her hands folded in her lap. But I could feel the storm brewing inside her because I knew what they didn't. I knew that her family back home was wealthy, well established, with businesses and savings that could easily cover that kind of money. And I also knew that's exactly why my in-laws were turning to us. Because word had gotten around. Whispers at family gatherings that my wife came from money. And suddenly the same accent they mocked became the key to their survival. I asked, "Why us? Why not the bank?" And my mom said quickly, "We tried, but the interest is too high. The terms are impossible. And we thought maybe her family could help. Just a loan, just temporary." And she looked straight at my wife when she said it. Not at me, not at her own son, but at the woman they had mocked for months. And that was the moment I saw the shift. The irony so thick it almost made me smile. Because they had spent months treating her like she was lesser, laughing at her roots. And now those same roots were the only lifeline they had. My wife looked at me, her eyes steady, calm, and I knew she was weighing her pride against her kindness. Because she is generous to a fault. But I also knew she hadn't forgotten every joke, every smirk, every fake compliment, and for the first time I didn't feel the need to shield her from them. I wanted her to see this, to feel the power of the truth finally tilting in her favor. My dad cleared his throat again. "We wouldn't ask if we weren't desperate. We know it's a lot. But we thought maybe her parents could wire it. Just until things get better." And my wife finally spoke. Her accent as clear and beautiful as I'd ever heard it. "You want me to ask my family for money after you laughed at me for months?" And the silence that followed was like a bomb going off. Their faces blanching, their mouths opening and closing with no sound. Because they hadn't expected her to call them out. They had expected her to quietly swallow the insult and hand them the lifeline. But instead she turned their mockery into a mirror and forced them to look at themselves. And trust me, the reflection wasn't pretty. The room was dead silent after my wife spoke. Her words cutting sharper than any scream could. "You want me to ask my family for money after you laughed at me for months?" And I swear the air itself seemed to stop moving. My mom's lips trembled as if she wanted to deny it. My dad's jaw clenched tight like he was fighting the urge to snap. And my sister looked down at her hands twisting together because deep down they all knew she was right. They all knew every little dig, every mocking word, every fake laugh had been real and cruel and unforgettable. And now it had all come back to choke them at the exact moment they needed her most. And part of me wanted to stand and clap for my wife because for the first time since this started she wasn't shrinking. She wasn't forcing a polite smile. She was staring them down with all the dignity and strength they had refused to see in her. My dad tried to recover first, clearing his throat, his voice forced into that fake calm tone he used when he thought he was negotiating. "We didn't mean it like that. You have to understand. Families joke. That's all it was. Jokes. But my wife didn't flinch. She tilted her head slightly and said, "A joke is funny to everyone, not just the people laughing at someone else." And that one line hit him harder than anything I could have said in my entire life. Because for once my father had no comeback. Just silence and the faint flush of shame creeping up his neck. My mom reached forward then, tears already pooling in her eyes. The kind of tears she always summoned when she wanted sympathy. And she said, "Sweetheart, we love you. We were just teasing. You're part of this family. Can't you see that?" And my wife shook her head slowly. Her voice calm but firm. "I saw the way you looked at me. The way you spoke to me. And I heard the laughter. Don't try to tell me it was love." And watching her like that, so strong, so steady, I realized this wasn't just about money or mockery. This was about respect, about finally ripping away the mask they wore and forcing them to admit the truth. My sister spoke up next. Her voice small. "We didn't mean to hurt you. We were wrong. But please, we're desperate. We really need this." And that desperation cracked the polished pride my parents had always carried. It revealed the truth I had never seen before, that behind their arrogance was fear. Fear of losing everything. Fear of falling from the pedestal they had built for themselves. And in that moment I felt something shift inside me. A strange mix of satisfaction and sadness. Because I knew karma had arrived and it was sitting in that room with us. Balancing the scales without mercy. My wife looked at me then. Her eyes searching. And I knew she was torn. Because her heart is kind and generous. She wanted to help even the people who hurt her. But she also wanted them to understand what they had done. To truly feel the weight of it. And I squeezed her hand and said, "It's your choice. No one else's. Not mine. Not theirs. Yours." And she nodded slowly. Taking a deep breath, turning back to them with a steady gaze. "If I ask my family for this money, it won't be for free. It won't be without acknowledgement. Because if you want their help, you have to admit the way you treated me. You have to apologize. And you have to mean it." My dad's face twisted, pride warring with need. My mom gasped like the very idea of apologizing was unthinkable. And my sister whispered, "Dad, please, just say it. We don't have a choice." And for the first time in my life I saw my father look small. Not strong, not in control, but small, cornered by his own actions. And he finally muttered, almost choking on the words, "We're sorry," and my mom echoed it, tears running. "We're sorry. We shouldn't have treated you that way. We shouldn't have laughed." And I swear in that moment the room shifted. Because the power dynamic had flipped completely. The people who mocked her were now bending. The people who dismissed her were now pleading. And my wife sat there calm, dignified, her accent still strong and beautiful as she said softly, "Now I believe you. And maybe now my family will too." And watching it unfold I realized that revenge hadn't come through anger or shouting. It had come through truth and timing. Through the cruel irony of life itself. Because the same accent they had mocked had become the very reason they were on their knees. And I knew this was only the beginning of the lesson they were about to learn. The silence after their apology stretched so long you could hear the clock ticking on the wall, and for once in my life my parents didn't look like the powerful, unshakable figures I grew up with. They looked like people cornered by their own mistakes. People who had no shield left but hollow words. And my wife sat there watching them with a calm so steady it almost frightened me because I knew inside she was replaying every moment they had reduced her to a punchline. Every laugh that echoed in her head when she lay awake at night wondering if she would ever be accepted. And now she had the power to decide whether to extend mercy or to let them drown in the consequences of their pride. And my father tried to reclaim some ground. His voice firm but not steady. "So if we apologize, if we admit it, will your family help us?" And my wife didn't answer right away. She took a slow sip of water, set the glass down carefully, and then said in her accent that now rang like music in my ears, "That depends. Because money without change is wasted. And if you want my family's help you must promise not only repayment but respect. Respect for me. Respect for where I come from. Respect for the roots you mocked." And my mother looked like she had swallowed fire. Her pride burning her from the inside. But she was too desperate to argue. She nodded quickly, tears spilling as if to seal the deal. While my sister whispered again, "Please, we'll do anything. Just don't let us lose the house." I glanced at my wife, giving her the silent support to choose whatever path she felt was right. And she finally nodded. "I will ask, but you will come with me. You will face my parents. You will look them in the eye and tell them the truth. That you mocked their daughter. That you needed her more than she needed you. And then maybe they will decide whether you are worth helping. My dad stiffened, horror flashing across his face at the thought of bowing his head to people he had secretly considered beneath him. But he had no choice and he knew it. So he gritted his teeth and muttered, "Fine." Over the next week preparations were made. Calls exchanged. And the tension in my family's home grew unbearable. My father pacing endlessly. My mother alternating between sobbing and snapping. My sister pleading with both of them not to ruin this chance. And finally the day came when we sat across from my wife's parents at their long polished dining table. The air heavy with tradition and pride. And my in-laws, who had always welcomed me warmly despite my family's cruelty, sat quietly waiting to hear why these people who mocked their daughter now wanted their help. My father cleared his throat, his voice awkward and stiff. We made mistakes. We laughed at her when we shouldn't have. We didn't understand. And now we're asking for forgiveness and assistance. And the words dragged out of him like stones tied to his tongue. And my wife's father leaned forward, his expression unreadable. So you laughed at her accent, treated her like less, and now you want us to save you. And my dad flinched. My mom cried harder. My sister whispered desperately, "Yes, please, we're sorry." And my wife sat perfectly still, her head held high, letting them squirm under the weight of their own hypocrisy. My in-laws exchanged a glance, silent communication flowing between them. And then my wife's mother spoke, her voice soft but firm. "We do not mock our family. We do not shame our blood. And if she forgives you, then perhaps we can too." And everyone's eyes turned to my wife, who after all the months of being belittled, after all the nights she told me she was used to it, now held all the power in her hands. She looked at my parents for a long time, letting the silence carve its own scars. And then finally said, "I forgive, but I do not forget. And if you ever disrespect me again, this door will close forever." And with that she nodded to her father, who finally said, "We will help, but on our terms." And the deal was struck. But as we left that night, watching my parents walk out of that house with their pride shattered, I realized something deeper than money had changed. Because for the first time in my life my parents understood that the woman they mocked was stronger, prouder, and more valuable than they had ever imagined. And no amount of loans could repay the lesson they had just been forced to learn. Walking out of my in-laws' house that night felt like stepping into a different world. The air sharper, cleaner, as if something heavy had finally cracked open. But behind us my parents moved slowly, weighed down not by debt alone but by the humiliation of having to beg the very person they had belittled. And I watched them shuffle toward the car with their heads low and realized this was a kind of justice I could never have orchestrated myself. Because no lecture, no argument, no angry defense of my wife could have hit harder than the reality of needing her more than she ever needed them. Over the weeks that followed, the loan arrangements were made. Contracts signed under the careful eyes of my wife's parents, who were not foolish enough to let prideful people take without accountability. And my father grimaced with every signature. My mother dabbed at her eyes as if tears could erase ink. And my sister whispered thanks that rang hollow because they were too late. And my wife never once gloated, never once threw their mockery back in their faces. Instead, she carried herself with quiet dignity, speaking clearly in the accent they had once twisted into a weapon. And every time she spoke in those meetings I could see my parents flinch slightly, as though the sound of her voice now reminded them not of something to laugh at but of the moment they had been brought to their knees. At family gatherings afterward the shift was undeniable. Gone were the little digs, the smirks, the exaggerated imitations, replaced with careful silence, measured words, almost an anxious respect. And though my wife remained polite, she was no longer chasing their approval. She sat with her back straight, her eyes calm, her laughter genuine but reserved, because she had nothing left to prove and everything to command. One evening after dinner, when we were finally alone, she looked at me and said softly, "Do you see now why I told you I was used to it?" And I shook my head, taking her hands. "You should never have been used to it. But they'll never forget what happened. They'll never dare mock you again." And she smiled faintly. "That's not why it mattered. It mattered because they needed to see who I am, not who they thought I was." And she was right, because the money wasn't the lesson. The money was just a mirror. It showed them that the woman they mocked was the very woman who held their future in her hands. And that truth was worth more than every dollar they borrowed. Months passed. They paid back slowly, swallowing their pride with each installment. And though the relationship would never be what it could have been, it was honest now, stripped bare. And I realized sometimes family doesn't grow through comfort but through the sharp cracks of consequence. And here's the thing. When people show you who they are, believe them, but also know that life has a way of circling back, of placing power in the hands of those once dismissed. And when that moment comes, you don't need anger. You don't need revenge. You just need to stand tall and let the truth speak for itself. Because nothing is louder than dignity that refuses to bow. My wife's accent never changed, but the way they heard it did. And that was the sweetest justice of all.